Who was Sojourner Truth by Jonah Zeldis McDonald. Who was Sojourner Truth? June 1st, 1843. The tall woman walked down to the ferry in New York City, paid the fare, and got on. Although the woman was black and had been born a slave, she was now free to come and go as she pleased. When the ride ended, she got off the ferry and began to walk. Soon the hustle and bustle of the city was far behind her. After a while she grew thirsty and stopped at a farm to ask for a drink. The woman who gave it to her asked her name. The tall woman thought about this. The only full name she had was a slave name, given to her by her master. She did not want that name anymore. She was starting a new life. She was going to be doing a lot of traveling, and she was going to spread the word of God. So right then and there, she gave herself a new name. She decided to call herself Sojourner Truth, and this is her story. Chapter 1, Early Days. Sometime around 1797, a baby girl called Isabella was born. Her nickname was Belle. Because her parents, James and Betsy Baumfree, were slaves, Isabella was a slave too. This meant that they belonged to someone. They were not free. Their master was a white man named Johann Hardenberg. Since Mr. Hardenberg was from Holland, he spoke Dutch. That was the language Belle grew up speaking too. James and Betsy worked very hard on Mr. Hardenberg's farm. He did not pay them. They could not leave. They had to do whatever he wanted. It was a harsh and terrible life. They had many children, maybe as many as 12. Almost all of them were sold by Mr. Hardenberg. Betsy and James never saw these children again. The farm Belle and her parents lived on was in Swartkill, New York. Here's New York, here's Swartkill. Many people think that slavery only existed in southern states like Virginia, Louisiana, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. But back in the 1700s, slavery was legal in many northern states too. When Belle was about 3, Johann Hardenberg died. His son Charles inherited all his property. This meant Charles owned his father's house, his land, his horses, and his cows, and his father's slaves. Charles took the slaves and the animals to his home. He had no room for these people, so they had to live in the cellar. The cellar was cold, dark, and damp. It was smelly and crowded, too. 12 slaves lived there. Belle's bed was a wooden board. Not long after her family moved to the cellar, Belle had a surprise. It was a new baby brother. His name was Peter. Betsy was happy about her son, but Betsy also worried. Her other children had been sold. Belle and Peter might be sold too. Betsy hoped that God would protect them. As Betsy's children grew, she told them about God who was in heaven. Whenever they were scared or sad, they could always ask God for help. In 1806, Charles Hardberg died. Belle was about 9. What would happen to her family now? Shortly after the funeral, Charles's property was sold off. By this time, Belle's father James could no longer do much work. His back was bent and stooped. He also had arthritis, a disease that crippled his hands and legs. Slaves like James were hard to sell. Often they ended up getting turned out by their masters. This meant that they were free, but they were not given a place to live or any money to live on. They were old and often sick, so they could not take care of themselves. As a result, they often died. Along with James, Betsy was turned out. Where would they go? They begged to stay. The Hardenberg family agreed they could remain in the cellar. Belle and Peter were young and able to work hard. Healthy slaves, especially boys, were worth a lot of money. At a slave auction, they both were sold. Peter was sold first. He went to a man who did not live close by. Belle was so sad, but she remembered what her mother had said about God. He would protect her, so Belle silently repeated a prayer she knew. After Peter was sold and led away, it was Belle's turn on the block. The auctioneer called out her name and told the buyers about her. She did not speak English, only Dutch, so she could not understand what he said, but she got the idea loud and clear. At first, there were no buyers. Then the auctioneer added a flock of sheep. Finally, a man named John Neely bought her for $100. Slave auctions. When slaves from Africa were brought to the United States, they were sold at auction. Held in pens, their skin was smeared with grease or tar to make it look healthy. They were branded like cattle. Buyers forced their mouths open to see if they had good teeth and tested their muscles for strength. The biggest, strongest looking slaves were bought first because it was thought they could work the hardest. Families were split up and never saw each other again. In a grab and go auction, the buyer gave the slave trader a set amount of money. A drum roll sounded and the slave pen opened. The buyer rushed in and grabbed the slave or slaves that he wanted. In the highest bidder auction, slaves were shown one at a time. If more than one buyer wanted a slave, the buyers would bid. The buyer who bid the most money won. Mr. Neely thought he got a good deal, but his wife did not think so. The Neelys were from England. They spoke English, not Dutch. They lived near Kingston, New York, and ran a store. The store was not doing well. Many of the people who lived nearby were Dutch. They did not trust the English owners, so they did not shop at the store. Mrs. Neely took out her anger at the Dutch settlers on Belle. Belle was the only slave owned by the Neelys. They made her work inside the house, cleaning and cooking. Belle found her new life hard. She missed her parents, and since she did not speak English, she did not understand what was said to her. She tried her best to learn English, but Mrs. Neely was not a good teacher. When Belle got a word wrong, Mrs. Neely slapped her. One Sunday morning, Mrs. Neely was so mad she sent Belle out to the barn. Mr. Neely was waiting there. He beat her so badly that she fainted. Belle had never been beaten before. She told herself she would work extra hard to keep from being beaten again. Not too long after this, her father came to visit. He saw that Belle had no shoes. Her thin clothes were no protection against the winter cold. James was sick and old, yet he saw Belle suffering and knew he had to help her. Since he had been turned out, he was no longer a slave, but he didn't have the money to buy Belle and set her free. Maybe he could help another way. James got Martin Scriver to buy Belle. Scriver was a fisherman. He also had a farm and a tavern. He and his wife were not educated people, but they spoke both Dutch and English. This made life easier for Belle, and she was able to learn English more easily now, too. For the next 18 months, Belle lived with the Scrivers. She grew tall and strong like her father had once been. All day long she worked. When the fishing boats came in, she helped unload them. In the fields, she planted corn and hoed it too. She did errands and worked at the tavern. Unlike her other masters, the Scrivers gave her enough food, warm clothes, and a decent place to live, but they did not allow Belle to go to school. Slaves were forbidden from learning to read and write. Those who disobeyed were severely punished. It was while Belle was at the Scrivers that she got terrible news. Her mother had died. Now her family would never be reunited. And what would happen to her father? He could not manage on his own. Belle was right to worry. Her father died not long after her mother. With her brother far away, Belle was now alone in the world. Once again, she thought of her mother's words. God was watching her. God cared about her. She would never be alone. One day a man came into the tavern. He saw how strong Belle was and offered to buy her for $300. That was 3 times as much as the Scrivers had paid for her. Even though the Scrivers had agreed to buy Belle, now they sold her. She went to New Paltz with her new master, John Dumont. She did not know what he would be like, but she would soon find out. Chapter 2, Freedom Ahead. In 1810, John Dumont wrote in his record book that Belle was about 13, but that she stood nearly 6 feet tall. He bragged about her. He said she could do more work than his strongest male slaves, but his wife did not like her. She told the white maids that they should lord it over poor Belle. That meant they could give Belle a hard time. In fact, Mrs. Dumont wanted them to grind her down. One time, when Belle boiled potatoes, Mrs. Dumont scolded her. She said the water in the pot was dirty. The next day, Belle scrubbed the potatoes extra hard. They were clean before she put them in the water to boil. But later, when Mrs. Dumont looked in the pot, the water was dirty. Mrs. Dumont was very angry. Belle didn't understand how this had happened. Luckily, Mrs. Dumont's 10-year-old daughter, Gertrude, liked Belle. Gertrude thought that Katie, one of the maids, was the problem, so she hatched a plan. Belle set the potatoes to boil. Then she went to milk the cows. Gertrude hid in the kitchen. She saw Katie come in and sprinkle ashes in the pot. Gertrude jumped out of her hiding place. She told her parents what Katie had done. Belle was not blamed anymore. Despite Gertrude's kindness, Belle was lonely at the Dumonts. Then she met Robert. He was a slave too. She first saw him at a feast that came 50 days after Easter. They were dancing, singing, and food. There was dancing, singing, and food. Robert began visiting Belle. They fell in love. Mr. Catlin, Robert's master, did not like this. He wanted Robert to marry one of his own slaves. That way, any children born would belong to Mr. Catlin, too. If Robert and Belle had children, they would belong to Mr. Dumont. Robert did not obey his master. He continued to visit Belle in secret. When Mr. Catlin caught him, he beat him. Belle begged Mr. Dumont to do something. Although it was highly unusual, Mr. Dumont told Mr. Catlin to stop. He ordered Mr. Catlin off his property, then he followed him home to make sure he did not kill Robert. But Mr. Catlin did not plan to kill Robert. He beat him to make him obey, and it worked. Robert did not visit Belle anymore. He married the woman his master had chosen. Mr. Dumont decided Belle needed a husband. He picked one of his own field slaves named Thomas. Belle wanted to be married by a preacher, and Mr. Dumont agreed. Belle and Thomas were married around 1817. Belle was about 20 years old. Belle and Tom grew to care for each other. Tom had been married before. After his first wife was sold, he had run away to find her. He loved her very much. Tom never did find her because slave catchers found him. He was sent back to the Dumonts where he was beaten. His scars made Belle weep. Tom was a good man. One year after they married, Belle and Tom had a daughter, Diana. Over the next 10 years, they would have 4 more children, Elizabeth, Hannah, Peter, and Sophia. Slave catchers. In 1857, there was a landmark court case involving a man named Dred Scott. He was a slave who had escaped from his master and lived in a free state for many years. But the court decided that didn't mean he was free. He was still a slave and had to return to his master. As a result of the decision, there was now money to be made in catching escaped slaves and returning them to their owners. Slave catchers were the people who hunted down the runaway slaves. They were paid for every slave they caught. The returned slaves were brutally punished with beatings and whippings. Wonderful news arrived in 1817. A new law was passed in New York State. All slaves born before July 4th, 1799 had to be freed by July 4th, 1827. This meant Belle and her husband would be set free in 10 years. Since their children had been born after 1799, they would not be free until the boys were 28 and the girls were 25. John Dumont even promised that he would free Belle and Tom in 1826, a year earlier than the law called for. They could live in a cabin on his land. In exchange for her early freedom, Belle worked even longer hours than usual. She worked in the fields planting crops. She worked in the house washing, cooking, and cleaning. She spun big piles of wool into yarn for knitting. Then she hurt her hand on a scythe, which is a sharp hand tool used to cut grass or reap crops. The wound did not heal. Still, she kept part of the bargain. She kept her part of the bargain. But when Freedom Day came, Mr. Dumont did not honor his promise. He said Belle could not have done much extra work with a wounded hand. The deal was off. Belle was furious. Tom told her not to be upset. They would be freed the next year. But Belle was not waiting. She woke up early and put her few belongings in a pillowcase. She knew she could not take all her children with her, so she left the four eldest with Tom and took only the baby, Sophia. Then she snuck away from Mr. Dumont's farm. Belle went to a white family named the Van Wagners. She had learned of them through Levi Rowe, a Quaker who lived down the road. The Van Wagners were abolitionists. That meant they thought slavery was wrong. They would do whatever they could to help runaway slaves. The Van Wagners let Belle and her baby stay with them. She would work for them, but they would not own her. She could leave any time she wanted. Quakers. The Quakers, also called Friends, are a Christian group started in England in the mid 1600s. Quakers believe that people do not need ministers to communicate with God. Instead, a person can speak directly to God. The Quakers who lived in 19th century America dressed in plain and simple clothes. They were against all forms of violence and refused to fight in any wars. They were also abolitionists and risked their lives by helping many slaves escape to freedom. Hours later, John Dumont found Belle in her new home. He wanted her back, but she refused to go. The Van Wagners paid him $20 to free her a year early. They paid $5 for Sophia. Belle and her child were free at last, but Belle's happiness was short-lived. She found out her son Peter had been sold to slave owners in Alabama. She would never see him again. Belle could not accept this. From her Quaker friends, Belle learned that selling Peter to a southern state was against the law in New York. You could not sell slaves out of state, so the law was on Belle's side. Later, Belle remembered thinking, I was sure God would help me to get him. Why I felt so tall within, I felt as if the power of a nation was with me. Belle's Quaker friends sent her to Poppletown, New York. It was close to the county seat in Kingston. The Quaker couple had friends there who would let her stay in their house. Belle walked to Poppletown. It took Belle almost all day to get there. She had never walked so far all by herself, and when she finally got there, she was very tired. Her host offered her food and a bed for the night. Years later, Belle wrote that she had never slept in such a nice, high, clean, white, beautiful bed. She was too scared to get in, so she crawled under it instead. Then she worried she might offend her host, so she crawled out and slept in the beautiful bed. The next day, she went to the courthouse. There, she filed a complaint against the man who sold Peter out of state. His name was Solomon Gedney. The judge agreed with Belle. The sale was against the law. Mr. Gedney could not believe there was all this fuss over a slave. It took many months, but Peter was returned to his mother. Since Gedney had broken the law in selling Peter, Peter was now free. Belle had won. She was one of the first Black women in the country to win a case like this. Belle and Peter stayed and worked for the Van Wagners in Kingston. Sophia, who was about 2 years old, went to live at the Dumonts with her sisters Diana, Hannah, and Elizabeth. Belle's husband Tom was freed on July 4th, 1828, but he stayed in New Paltz. Tom's health was not good, making it hard for him and Belle to live together. He died by the end of the year. All he got was a little taste of freedom. Life with the Van Wagners was comfortable. Belle was able to visit her daughters. She and Peter joined a Methodist church. There she met a school teacher from New York City named Miss Gear. Miss Gear liked Belle and thought Peter was very bright. She encouraged Belle to move to New York City. There were plenty of jobs there. Best of all, there were schools for Black children. Belle talked it over with her daughters, and they thought it was a good idea. They promised to take care of Sophia, so Belle decided to leave. She made this decision by herself. She did not have to ask a master's permission. At the end of the summer of 1829, Belle and Peter took a boat down the Hudson River. They were on their way to New York City. A new life was waiting for them. And so next time we will read chapter 3 and find out about their life in the big city.